Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Heckett, you testified that, of course, no private market provider will choose to write FEMA's severe repetitive loss properties. And really, that's no surprise, because repeatedly flooded properties make up 1% of those insured by NFIP, but it represents 25 to 30% of all the flood claims. And so they're not a good risk for private insurers or for the American taxpayer. And today, Congressman Blumenauer and I introduced a bill, H.R. 1558. This is the Repeatedly Flooded Communities Preparation Act. And the concept here is to proactively reduce flood risk instead of continuing our current model of rebuilding these properties over and over again. The way we do it, and let me just give you by way of example, we've got a couple of cities here, Tulsa and Charlotte. Both have had very pronounced success in decreasing flood risk, because what they did was proactively take on a plan for stormwater management. That's the first thing they did. Promoting voluntary buyouts, sometimes that can be effective. Reviewing new development proposals for flood impacts every time one came up. And steering development away from risky areas. So that's part of their plan. Many of their peers, though, many of the other cities and communities have not kept up with that kind of approach. So what this bill would require is that communities with a large amount of repeatedly flooded properties to implement plans, to have that city council or those counties put forward that plan for lowering flood risk, and then in terms of keeping the records, holds them accountable for failing to act. That's what the bill does, and I would just ask for thoughts on this issue, and I also would ask Mr. Heckett a follow-up question here that I wanted to get to, and that's, do you think the home buying public truly grasps flood risk? Is this registering with them? Do they understand how subject to hazard their property is when they talk with their realtor? Do they understand how flood risks change over time when areas nearby are developed or when a forest fire might occur? And so maybe I could ask the panel also on that aspect about recommendations for how we can change this lack of education on flood risk. Besides just what we could do at the county level or city level, how do we improve take-up rates for flood insurance and strengthen these mitigation efforts?
Let me address both of your questions. My statement that, of course, we would not want to write severe repetitive loss properties is a statement that we would not want to write severe repetitive loss properties at rates that were competitive with FEMA, because FEMA charges much too little for the severe repetitive loss properties. The Wharton study last year regarding consumer recognition of flood risk, consumers actually overestimate, per their study, consumers overestimate consumers think their property is going to flood more than it actually does. They overestimate that, but they underestimate the amount of damage that an actual flood would do.
Mm-hmm. Other members of the panel want to jump in on that?
Congressman Royce, we've taken a look at the legislation that you and Congressman Blumenauer have introduced, and actually what we're supportive, and one of the things that we like about it is that it does have a measure of accountability under current law, which comes from the Stafford Act. Community mitigation plans are required to at least assess how many repetitive loss properties there are, but it doesn't really require them to do anything about it. And so I think the innovative element to this legislation is that it does have some requirements there to actually do some planning and actually mitigation of those or face some potential consequences. In terms of the broader education and awareness of risk, and I go back to a statement I made in my testimony, we've got to, first of all, map all of these areas in the country. Oroville Dam, I think, is a great example in California. 200,000 people evacuated, far beyond what the mapped floodplain showed, yet how many of those people knew that they were in a dam, basically either a dam failure or a dam release inundation zone? Probably none of them, because that information, while it has been produced, it's not publicly available. And that's a, that's a particular
Thank
issue.
you. I thank the panel. Our time's expired, but transparency is part of this answer. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back the chair, now recognizes the ranking member.